In today's video, we are going to talk about Procs Lambdas. Let's get to it. So with Procs and Lambdas, they actually work very similar to methods. And if you haven't seen the methods video, be sure to click right there and that will get you up to speed of what I'm talking about. But within Procs and Lambdas, they actually work very similar to methods, but it's a different way of how we're using them. And also Procs and Lambdas, they're pretty similar, but they do have similarities and differences as well. The main thing about Procs and Lambdas is that both of them, they are wrappers that you wrap around a block of code. And then you usually set them to a variable so you can use them later so you can call in that block of code. And what I mean by a block of code is any logic that is grouped together inside of a coding block. And that could be grouped together with a do end or a curly brace, things like that. Those are called a block of code. Now let's actually go into each of them one by one, and let's first talk about procs. And with procs, you can actually do a new prop with the prop.new or just the regular lowercase proc like that. And that will create a new proc object for you to use. And again, you usually would put this as a variable. That way you can code and reference it later on. And when you are returning inside of a proc, it doesn't actually just return from the proc itself. It returns from wherever the proc is in, as well as anything else inside of the proc. So that is one of the differences about procs and lambdas, is that the proc actually returns from the context and also the proc itself. And then there's ways of calling procs or using them, and it's very similar to calling methods. And when we are calling procs, works pretty much the same way. You can pass in arguments, things like that. And the other difference about procs and lambdas is that procs really doesn't care about arguments or parameters. Whether you're passing in arguments or parameters within procs is either the right number of arguments or not even passing in enough. It doesn't yell at you for it. It will still think that you're still running the proc and it won't give you any errors. Now let's get into what a proc will look like. And again, there's multiple ways that you would use a proc to create one. I'm just going to use proc.new just because that is the most clear cut and it's actually the most used from what I've seen. So here, what you would do is you would declare however it is you're using the proc. And in this case, we're using the .new. And then inside of curly brace, you can use parameters or you can use whatever it is that you are having with it. And here I'm just having the name being passed through and I'm just inputting that name. And here I am actually calling this name here. Technically this would be a bad variable name because this matches the parameter of here. But how I am using this is I'm setting it to a variable called name. And then when I am calling this variable of name, I can then call the proc using these 3 to 4 items. And you can do a .call, parentheses, box bracket, or the .==. But again, I think the most common way that people use the proc call is just .call because it's just the clearest of what you're actually doing. You're calling the proc itself. So this is how you would use it and create it. And then how you would use it is set it to a variable and you're calling that variable however it is you're calling it, mostly with .call. Now, if we are returning within the proc itself, for example, if I put a return here, that will return the string of the interpolated name. But since this is technically a prop, not only will it return here, it will also return from wherever it is the proc is within. And for this example, we actually have this within a method, and this will return name within the method as well. So this will only return inside of the proc and also within the context, which is the method here. So the whole method returns the name. And that might be something you want and it might be something you don't want. So that really depends on how it is you're using, and that is the return there. Next, let's talk about arguments. And when you are using arguments within a proc, it doesn't care of however many or however less of arguments you're passing in. And you can pass in the arguments and parameters with the call. You can just have them separated by commas. And with procs, it doesn't care whether or not you pass them in or not. It can use them or it doesn't use them. So it's not really picky about arguments and parameters. Now let's talk about lambdas. And lambdas are technically a proc. It's just a special way of how we're using them and how we are writing them. And you can create a lambda with the keyword lambda, or you can use this arrow like so. It's a dash and a caret that looks like an arrow. So here, you also usually would put it inside of its own variable. That way you can reference it and use it later on. And then when you're calling it, you would call the variable that you're referencing. But the difference between lambdas and procs is that for lambdas actually return the block itself. So instead of having it return within the context, you have it return in the code block. So it will only return within the lambda itself, not whatever the lambda is in. The other thing about lambdas and how it's also different to props is that it does care about arguments. So if you are passing in arguments, or if the lambda requires a certain number of arguments, you have to pass in the right amount or it will give you an error. So now let's take a look at how lambdas are used, as well as how they're being defined and being called. So here we're actually just doing the same exact logic. You can just do it with the lambda. You can use a method or a lambda or a proc. It really doesn't matter what this simplicity of code is, just depending on your preference. But here you can see that with the lambda, keyword lambda, or you can do this symbol right here. I've seen it be done both ways. There's not really a common one. They're both used the same amount of way. Maybe the lambda one to be much more explicit of what you're using. So when you are creating a lambda, again, you would have to have it connected and set to a variable. And you can go ahead and call the variable the exact same way of how you call a proc, with the dot call, parentheses, box bracket, or dot equals. And that is how you would use a lambda, very similar to a proc itself, with defining, using it, and calling it. But let's go ahead and take a look at the key difference within a lambda, and one of it is with the return. So with the return here, if I am returning within the lambda itself, then it will just return within the lambda. So name will actually be the interpolated value of the return value, which is the name here. But the thing about lambdas is that it will only return within the code block. So here within the method itself, it won't return within that method because we're not returning within the method, we're returning within the lambda. And that's also how lambdas work. Now the other key differences is about arguments and parameters. And if I need to pass in certain amount of arguments like name and age for this lambda, then here when I am calling it, I need to pass in those same amount of arguments. And if I am passing the same amount of arguments, then it will run the lambda like normal. But if I'm not, if I'm just passing one or one too many, then you are given this error or some sort of error like this, where it says argument error, wrong number of arguments, given however many expected to, or something like that. So it'll give you some error that is like this. And what this error means is that you're given one too many arguments or not enough arguments. So it does yell at you if you don't pass in the right amount of arguments with lambdas. So just to wrap up, with procs and lambdas, they're just wrappers for you to return blocks of code. They work very similarly to methods, but they actually work a little bit differently depending on what they are. Again, with procs, how you would create them is with the new or the proc, and with both procs and lambdas, you can use them as a variable as well as calling them, you can call them the exact same way. It's just the difference between the proc and the lambda is that when you are returning in a proc, it returns from the proc as well as the context. And procs don't really care about arguments. But with lambdas, you can define them with lambdas or this arrow. They do care about arguments, and also they return from the code block itself. But calling and setting them to variables are the exact same things. And that pretty much sums up of what a proc and lambda is. And again, this is just another tool within your arsenal for you to use to help program your applications. In most cases, you may not even use a proc or a lambda, or in some cases you might, but now you actually know what they are. If you have any questions about procs and lambdas or anything else, don't forget to comment down below and I will get back to you as soon as I can. And I will see you in the next video. See ya!